Everybody, thank you all for jumping in here today, and we appreciate your time very much. Give everybody, I thank you to those of you who are a minute or two early. My name is Liam. I'm going to be our presenter today. We're going to let everybody roll in and get their audio set up. So I'm just going to stay on mute in the background for just another 2 minutes so we can make sure everybody's able to get set up okay. And then the webinar, we will be well underway in just like 2 minutes here. Thank you again. All right, folks. So thank you all for jumping in here. For those of you that are on time or a little bit early, I see that we still have a bunch of people rolling in. So while we let everybody get set up with their audio, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. A couple of things worth mentioning regarding the webinar. Number one, and this is a question that we get most commonly on these presentations, is you will be receiving an email with a copy of the slides as well as the recording within 24 hours of the end of the presentation, okay? For those of you that are looking to get a certificate for having attended the webinar, that also will be sent out to you within 24 hours of the end of the webinar. So you'll get 2 emails, one with a certificate, one with slides and a copy of the actual webinar recording itself, if you would like to retain access to that or share it with others on your end, right? So you'll see those come through. Second thing I'll say is if you would like, these are webinars that we do. We usually do one webinar like this each quarter, okay? We do have monthly presentations you can get access to as well. If you'd like to check out on any of our other free resources or content, you can go to compliancygroup.com and look on there. We have lots of free content, lots of free stuff that you can get access to if you're just looking to generally educate yourself. The content of the webinar today is going to be a little bit different even than what we've done in the past, where historically we maybe are going general HIPAA compliance or talking about past breaches, fines, things that have occurred, and giving practical takeaways. We thought that it might be helpful to actually just go through line by line an actual OCR HIPAA audit. For those of you that maybe have never been through an OCR audit or were curious about what documentation you actually need within your practice in the event that a HIPAA audit should occur, that's what we're hoping to address today. And I'm seeing that if anybody's having audio issues, could you let me know either in the chat or in the question and answer box? All right, and apologies, Chris, looks like you might have been having some trouble. Hopefully we are good to go now. All right, awesome. Just making sure. All right, thank you. So we're going to be getting real practical here, going line by line through an actual HIPAA audit that one of our clients received, giving key practical takeaways and really just showcasing what do you actually need to have in the practice in the event that you're audited, okay? To start, we have just a couple of quick polls that we would like for everybody to answer to get just a quick pulse of how everybody's feeling as far as attendance on this webinar. The first poll I'm going to launch, you'll see this pop up in just a second. Anytime I launch a poll, it freezes a little bit on me. Okay, so the first, do you feel like you could pass a HIPAA audit today, should it occur? Just simply yes, no, or I'm not sure, depending on the category that you fall into. Hopefully a lot of you are feeling pretty confident as it is, in which case, we hope to just further enhance or maybe give you some tips for ways that you could simplify the way that this is being managed in the practice. For those of you that are not sure or don't think that you would pass a HIPAA audit today if it occurred, our goal is to make this very practical. So you leave the webinar today with some practical next action items, call it, for the business or the practice. So let me close up this poll. Okay, so 39% of you said that you feel very confident that you would pass a HIPAA audit if it occurs. That's fantastic. We had a mixture of 9% saying no and 51% saying that I'm not sure, okay? So I'll give a good mix in the presentation today of just, let's say, practical tips for those of you that are confident to help you simplify the way that some of this is being managed or documented, while also giving just kind of a strong basics for those of you that are not sure or don't feel that you would. Next question that we're going to ask is, and this is going to be directly tied in with kind of the core components of what we're covering as we're going through the actual HIPAA audit, is what are you currently documenting within the practice as far as your HIPAA compliance program is concerned? And you can pick everything that applies. So what do you currently have documented for the compliance program in your business or practice? You can select all of them, one of them, pick whichever one applies. And we'll go through it this way. We're going to let all these answers roll in because oftentimes we find that a lot of practices might prioritize things like technical security, but then they neglect some of the more practical documentation components of it. Others might be doing some type of an assessment, but they don't have supporting documentation around how they're remediating those gaps. And as you'll see as we go through this audit, that's going to be a really important component of this. I'm seeing we've got maybe 65% voted so far on the webinar. I'll give it another second or two for more answers to roll in. And we'll close this out. All right, so another very interesting result here. So most of you, 90%, are doing employee training. That's fantastic. That's kind of like basics of the basics, is making sure that you're training your staff. 75% said that you're doing risk assessment, another fantastic thing, super important. Only 44% said that you had remediation plans in place. And so that'll be something that I highlight today as we go through the audit. The way that you can think about it is, yes, HIPAA requires that you're doing an assessment where you identify potential gaps. But if you don't have clear proof or documentation then of how you remediated or addressed those gaps, it doesn't go a long way in helping you, okay? And that's another very common deficiency we find in a lot of practices, something that we'll talk about. And then last question, this is gonna be the last poll, and then we're gonna spend the rest of the time going through the content. What is the level of priority that HIPAA compliance has within your business? Because I think for everybody, obviously, if this is, let's say, answer this either for your own role or if you're the owner of the business, answer this as far as the overall level of priority. Because for some of you, this might be something that was just assigned to you. You don't really care that much about this, right? It's not that important. For others of you, this might be all that your job is. For others of you, you might be the owner of your practice and you want to make sure you're protecting yourself. And so looking at some of the answers here, this is good. Okay. I'm going to close out the poll and looking at the results. All right, so 52% said it's extremely important. That's great. So hopefully you enjoy the webinar today if this is kind of a key area of need for you. 25% said very important, 19% said important, and then 1% said not important, 3% said somewhat. Okay, so for those of you that, this is not a key area of importance, again, hopefully that for today, we're just giving you some key tips for ways that you could simplify this and make this manageable. For those of you that this is a kind of a key area of importance for you within your practice, business, or company, we hope you come away from this feeling really good, like you're confident, all right? So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to dive into some of the content here. For those of you that don't know anything about Compliancy Group, just to give you a little bit of background, our company, we have really built our business off of the idea of simplifying compliance so that our clients can confidently grow their businesses, right? Our vision when we originally founded the company, this was 18 years ago that Compliancy Group was founded, was we wanted to be an affordable option for organizations looking to simplify the way that they manage this, or as well as automated it. We've been doing this for 18 years. We've got over 500,000 users on the program across all 50 states. And most important thing I can tell you is that we have never in the history of our company had a client fail any type of a HIPAA audit, investigation, or be fined. We are endorsed or preferred by 40 plus of the different healthcare associations and specialties all over the country because of that. And I'm not saying that just to give ourselves a pat on the back. I'm saying that because the principles and the things that we're going to be talking about today are things that have been very clearly proven to work throughout 18 years of doing business, all of the dozens of audits that we have handled with our clients. We're looking to pass on some of that wisdom, okay? Now, to give a brief introduction to the overarching concept of HIPAA compliance, for those of you that are experienced, this might be a little bit more basic. For those of you that are coming to this and don't know a ton about HIPAA, we want to just set a really solid foundation before we actually go through the HIPAA audit in just a second. Okay, first thing to say is that at the highest of levels, what does HIPAA require? Okay, and the highest level requirement of HIPAA is that you have an effective compliance program. Okay, what does that mean? Essentially, right? So the document that you see on the screen, this is what's called the 7 fundamental elements of an effective compliance program. This comes directly from Health and Human Services and the Office of Inspector General as what they would consider to be kind of the overarching boilerplate requirement, okay, of what you need for the compliance program in your practice. Now, a couple of things before we even dig into the individual requirements here as far as these core components. The most important thing to highlight is just going to be that word effective, okay? It's called an effective compliance program because really what the government has published here is a set of very broad, almost vague guidelines. And so whether you're a small practice or a large hospital group or anybody else in between, the HIPAA rules apply to everybody in the exact same way. The rules don't change depending on the size or the scope or the nature of your business. It applies to everybody. The expectation of the HIPAA rules is not that you're checking these things off of a box and saying that you did it, but rather that you're practically understanding these requirements and implementing them into your specific practice, business, or organization in a way that is effective for you. And that's going to be different depending on who you are, right? But to look at kind of the overall framework here of what is required, HIPAA has 4 rules, okay? So there are 4 rules that comprise the HIPAA regulations as a whole. The privacy rule tends to be one of the simpler ones. This is where use and disclosure requirements come from. This is where things like right of access and a patient's right to access their records comes from. You then have things like the security rule. Okay, this is where the requirement comes from for the annual risk assessment for HIPAA or the ongoing assessment requirements, requiring administrative safeguards in the form of policies and training, physical safeguards, as well as technical and IT safeguards to ensure that all PHI is being protected. The omnibus rule is the 3rd HIPAA rule, and this has to do with third parties, right? What vendors are you using? Do you have signed business associate agreements with those vendors? Are they compliant? Have you vetted them? And then 4th and finally, breach notification, making sure that in the event that a breach or an incident occurs, HIPAA has very specific requirements around how you document that incident, right? How it is investigated, and then ultimately how it is reported on, okay? You'll see here, we kind of condensed this down. This is what we call the wheel here at Compliancy Group. A lot of people wind up thinking that, hey, we'll do a basic security risk assessment, we'll address some remediation and implement policies and training. But if you're if you don't have all of these different components here, a full risk analysis that covers those technical, physical, and administrative components, gaps and remediation reports, policies, procedures, training, BAA management, incident management, you'll see as we go through the audit, you would have a hard time replying, okay? So very quickly, what I would like to do is we do have a simple, it's a one-page HIPAA checklist. I just sent, if you would like to get access to that one-page HIPAA checklist, I just sent that link into the chat. It's a super practical resource. It's a one-page overview that kind of will walk you through these different components here, just so you can see where you're at overall and how you're doing. And I'm seeing more questions come through as far as handouts and slides. If you would like to get access to the checklist, you can click on that link in the chat, and the slides will be sent to everybody when we're done with the presentation today. Okay, you'll also get a recording and a certificate issued to you, right? So this is what really makes the foundations of HIPAA compliance, okay? I'll highlight that risk analysis for HIPAA is really what's most important, okay? Foundationally, this builds the basis and the foundation for your compliance program. It's how you even figure out what you need to be doing or what is effective for you across all those other different areas, okay? So if you don't know how you're gonna be doing that risk assessment this year, there are free resources available through the government for it. You could do it yourself. There are tons of companies that do it. That's part of what our software helps with if needed. But that should be one of the first things that you're figuring out if you are starting from a clean slate with your compliance program is how am I going to do my risk assessment this year? Because that'll give you a very clear direction across every other area of the compliance program, okay? And yeah, so I apologize if you're not able to get access to the chat box. Let me see. I will reply to your question directly with a link to the checklist. Okay, so hopefully this comes through now. All right, so you should have that now, hopefully. Now, we're gonna start going through the actual HIPAA audit. And again, this is a copy of an audit one of our clients received. It's been fully redacted, all dates, names, labels removed, okay? So no issues or worries on that front. We're going to get very practical here, okay? So stick with me as we go through these questions. We're going to kind of be highlighting some of these key areas of importance and areas of concern as far as what the government might ask you for and what documentation you'd want to be keeping on file in your response. All right, so first thing, and this is a question that we get very commonly, is how do you know that you've been audited? And the only way, or I'll say the first way that the government would notify you of an OCR audit, you could see a full copy of the audit questionnaire here, it's always gonna come in the mail. There are lots of companies out there that actually try to scam people by calling the practice, pretending to be the government, notifying you of a required assessment or documentation that you need to have. That's never gonna come from the government first, okay? The first notification you receive of an audit will always come via written letter in the mail. Sometimes the OCR will send a fax. If you're not responding to that letter, they will email, they will call, right? They will follow up with you. First notification of an audit will always come in the mail, okay? So that's what you wanna be on the lookout for. If you're getting phone calls from people pretending to be the government, you always wanna verify the source and make sure that you're addressing that, okay? Now, in terms of the OCR itself, the OCR is going to be the primary enforcement body of HIPAA. So Health and Human Services is they're the authors of the HIPAA regulations, right? They develop and they implement the regulations for HIPAA. The OCR is the enforcement body of HIPAA. So they're the ones that are actually conducting the audits, the investigations, and things of that nature. And in terms of what actually causes a HIPAA audit, how do you get on the OCR's radar? Years ago, the OCR used to primarily be doing random audits and assessments of large enterprise organizations. That is actually not the case anymore, okay? Nowadays, 65% of all of the OCR's audits and fines that are being levied are actually directed towards small private practices. And the main thing that can cause you to get on the OCR's radar is often a patient complaint, Could be an employee whistleblower, meaning you have a disgruntled employee that also files a complaint or a report against you with the OCR or Health and Human Services. And then lastly is a reportable breach. So you had a breach, you reported it. The government will often follow up and request information concerning the breach, particularly if it's more than 500 patient records. So what do you do when you get an audit? Okay, first thing is you don't want to panic. Okay, really the purpose of an audit, oftentimes you may not even have done anything wrong. Okay, and so you want to be thinking about that first and foremost. The OCR is going to complete a review and an analysis of your documentation around your compliance program. And these results don't always have to lead to a monetary fine or a monetary penalty. Often, if you're found to not be compliant, there could be a corrective action plan and a fine that gets levied, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Hopefully that does not happen to any of you that are on this webinar by the time you get off, okay? We wanna give you we wanna give you all the knowledge that you need to set this up properly. So step 2 is to really understand why you've been audited. Okay, so what was it that happened that led to you being notified of an audit by the OCR? What is it, a patient complaint or an employee whistleblower? Was it a breach report, right? You wanna really focus in on what was the reason for this audit and begin compiling as much documentation as you have around that specific incident or situation, be it a patient, be it an employee, or be it the breach that might have occurred. And you'll see why in just a second. Now, one of the best things that you could do is ensure that prior to ever being audited is making sure that you're prepared ahead of time, right? An ounce of preparation is worth a pound of cure. Making sure that you have some sort of either a solution in place, legal representation, cyber liability insurance, often offers assistance as well in the event of an audit. This is not something that you want to do alone. And keep in mind that you want to respond to an audit within 10 business days, okay? If you wait until, I think sometimes they give you 10 to 15 days to respond to the letter, if you wait very last minute or are overdue in your reply with documentation, it can often indicate a deficiency and can cause the audit to be escalated further, okay? The third thing is send only what is requested. And this is really kind of just good advice for any audit, right? So even if it's an IRS audit, let's say, for your taxes, you don't want to send more information than what is being asked of you, okay? If you're sending more information above and beyond than what the government is actually asking for, you could be potentially incriminating yourself, and you want to avoid that at all costs, okay? Do not send anything other than what they're asking you for. Make sure it's concise and clear. We have spoken to practices that in a reply to the OCR, they sent like thousands of pages of documentation, and that is not a good sign to an auditor, okay? If I'm an auditor, I wanna be able to look at exactly the question that I asked and the documentation that you supplied. I don't wanna have to be sifting through thousands of pages of information, okay? Now, the most important thing, we're going to keep saying this as we go through, okay? Documentation is key here, okay? It truly, and I'm gonna be a little bit blunt here, forgive me, it truly does not matter what you are doing in practice. What matters is what you are able to prove on paper. And so the first thing that the government often asks for, so you could see that first question on the audit was about the circumstances that led to the breach occurring. So in this particular assessment, the client was breached, they reported it, and the government is now following up, asking questions about what occurred. Question number 2, almost always is going to be for a copy of the enterprise-wide risk analysis performed by the practice prior to the incident and copies of anything done after the incident, okay? This is a very, very foundational requirement of HIPAA. So I'm going to say it again. If you have not done a HIPAA risk analysis or a risk assessment in some time, and you don't know how you're going to be doing that this year, that is one of the first things that you want to get set up within the practice. That is also one of the first things that the government would ask you for, as you can see in the event that you're being audited, okay? Proof of ongoing risk analysis is one of the easiest ways to show something called good faith effort. That is what a HIPAA audit is all about, okay? The government does not expect you to be bulletproof, okay? They expect you to have clear documentation showing that you made your best efforts to satisfy the requirements of the law, okay? So very basic of the basics, what is a HIPAA risk analysis? A HIPAA risk analysis is a documented review of your practice as it compares to the regulations of HIPAA, where you actually go through the regulatory requirements, document what you're doing, document what you're not doing, and then documenting something that's called remediation, okay, or corrective action, meaning you have a clear plan in place for how you're going to be addressing the gaps found in that assessment. And that's the next component here, okay? So you'll see that immediately following the question around risk analysis, the third question that the government asks is evidence of security measures implemented to address risks identified in the risk analysis. There's a few other components there concerning documentation of safeguards, documentation of actions that you took following the breach, okay? What does all of this mean? If you're doing an assessment and you're identifying your gaps, but you have no way of proving how you actually filled in the gaps that were found, it's just incriminating you. It's not helping you, right? All that you're showing to the government is, hey, we did an assessment and we found all these issues and then we never did anything about it, okay? If you don't currently have corrective action or remediation plans in place following previous assessments, that's going to be something that you want to make sure is clearly documented within the practice this year. And again, if you're keeping up with this doesn't have to be a huge deal, right? If you're doing your risk analysis and you're maintaining that documentation ongoing, it could just be a handful of remediation plans that you need to be making on an annual basis. Or usually what happens is your first time going through it, there might be a ton of things. You get everything that you need set up within the practice, and then you just maintain it going forward, okay? Either way, again, this whole concept of good faith effort, being able to show clear proof of what you have done within the practice is the most important thing. If it's not documented, it's not happening, okay, as far as the government is concerned, especially in an audit like this. They need to see proof, okay? And this then ties in with, in my opinion, something that is very commonly misunderstood. Okay, so we speak with a lot of practices, and one of the first questions that we often ask the practices that we speak to is, what do you have in place currently as far as policies, procedures, and training? Okay, and oftentimes the extent of the policies that are in place might be like patient forms that your patients are signing, or maybe like a basic HIPAA training and an onboarding document that your employees are going through. And what HIPAA requires is going to be much more robust than that. You should not only have patient forms that your patients are signing, there should be clear internal policies and procedures that apply to your staff that they are reading and signing off on each year, as well as trainings that they're going through, and that documentation is being maintained. You can see here a decent sized portion of the questions that the OCR is asking here in this particular audit come down to policies, procedures, and trainings for the privacy rule, the security rule, as well as breach notification, okay? What does all of that mean? Well, these are sets of standards that the law requires you to have in place within the practice, okay? So the government is asking a lot of questions about this because if you don't have up-to-date policies, or let's put it this a different way, you might have up-to-date policies, but it's a HIPAA binder that sits in the back of the office. You don't have proof that employees have signed off on it every year. It maybe has not been updated in a couple of years even, it's collecting dust, okay? That is not gonna help you in the event of an audit, okay? What you need is not only the clear policies and the trainings, but proof that your employees have reviewed them and agreed to them. And that ties in with something, employee attestations, tracking those, but also document versions. So there's an interesting question inside of this audit. You can see that the OCR is asking for a copy of the privacy rule policies and procedures on uses and disclosure of protected health information. Pretty straightforward, okay? But then they ask, please provide copies of the policies that were in place prior to the breach or the incident and those in place currently, if different. Another very easy way of being able to prove good faith effort to the government is just simply by keeping your policies up to date and logging it anytime that you make those changes, okay? Preferably, this should be done maybe electronically so that you can yank reports out of those systems, like and even in a Word document or in Google Drive, something like that. Could as well be done through a different software program. But document version is a very easy way of you being able to show the government in the event of an audit, hey, not only do we have policies, but we've been keeping them up to date, and here's the proof, okay? It's not something that a lot of people are able to do. It is always very impressive to the government when you're able to do that in the event of an audit or an investigation. So keep that in mind. And there was something else I was thinking about regarding document version. It'll come back to me. But part of it is also that oftentimes there's a delay in when the government would audit you as compared to when the complaint is received. So there might be a complaint filed against you. There might be a breach that occurs. The OCR may not audit you for 2 years after the fact, okay? So maintaining that documentation and those records back in time, all the way up to present, great way to show proof of your compliance program in the event of an audit, okay? And then the final component here, and this is the lion's share of it, is incident management requirements. So particularly in the event that a breach occurs, a lot of the questions that the government is asking you is going to be around how you responded to the incident, how it was reported, okay? Evidence of policies concerning incident management, as well as trainings for your staff, proof that you notified the appropriate parties, right? There is a lot of layers to that breach notification rule, which we discussed at the beginning. And so checking, part of this is number one, all of the employees in your staff should be receiving some type of an incident management training. And you should have breach notification policies as well, so that in the event that a breach occurs, you have a clear point of reference of how it needs to be handled that is kept up to date according to what the law requires. Okay, HIPAA requires, if you're a covered entity, as well as if you're a business associate, you need an incident log, okay? Breach determination, meaning is this breach reportable? Documentation of your investigation and any response or corrective action plans that you implemented following the incident. Basic security measures like data backup, disaster recovery, and emergency mode operation plan, other policies, okay? All of those things that kind of fall under the policy and procedure also connect back to incident management. In the event that you have a breach, you're gonna wanna make sure that you have all of those things, okay? Now, once the government, let's say, another thing I'll highlight here, let's go back one slide. You'll see on all of these questions, almost all of them, you'll see these very specific citations back to the regulatory codes of HIPAA. If you're doing a HIPAA risk analysis, those are the regulatory codes that you want to be in your risk assessment, okay? Because that allows you to then be able to clearly go back, see how you answered those questions when you did your assessment, what was implemented following, so that you could have clear proof of the government. Just another small little tidbit there, okay? So at this point, the Office for Civil Rights is going to gather all of this information that you sent, and they're going to complete a review. If they find that it contains a substantial or serious compliance violation, there is going to be either a corrective action plan in which you might be monitored for a period of 2 years and need to submit quarterly reports and documentation to the OCR. There could also be a monetary penalty, okay? Oftentimes, if you are audited, it is quite often public record, not always. This is usually published by the OCR. If it's a breach of more than 500 patient records, you actually get listed on something, it's commonly called the OCR Wall of Shame or the OCR Breach Portal. All HIPAA-related breaches of 500 plus patients are public record. And so the real risk here, oftentimes for most businesses, is it's not just a monetary fine. It's the fact that this is not what you want people seeing when they Google your practice, right? You don't want them seeing that you had a breach or a fine or an issue. You want to build trust with your patients, right? Or with your clients. And you can see a couple of these cases here. Again, last year was kind of an interesting year in that most of the fines that were levied were to small practices. So Northcutt Dental was fined due to issues concerning actually a third-party marketing firm that they were using, where they had impermissibly disclosed patient information to that firm. It was not covered under their business associate agreement. They did not have a notice of privacy practice, and they did not have anybody in the practice designated as the HIPAA privacy officer that this all rolled up to. $62,000 fine, okay? you have New England Dermatology and Laser Center, where they were improperly disposing of PHI. But you'll notice, even when a breach happens, you are rarely fined for the breach in and of itself. You're typically fined because you're missing some sort of a component of an effective compliance program. So in this case, New England Dermatology and Laser Center, they had done a risk assessment, but they hadn't implemented any type of remediation. Okay, so they were missing safeguards. They also were missing components of their risk analysis. The assessment that they had done was like an IT assessment, and they were missing some of those more administrative components covering policies and procedures. Even a small, so this is, I believe, a solo provider, Jacob and Associates, psychiatric practice, missing HIPAA policies, and it was a right of access complaint, meaning a patient was requesting their records and they did not reply it, leading to an investigation and a fine due to missing policies and procedures. Okay, so this is just to give a couple of real-world examples of where some of this can go wrong. Regardless of where you are at in your practice, our goal: review these slides, review that HIPAA checklist, figure out. And again, most important thing here, in my opinion, if you don't know how you're doing your risk analysis this year, that should be the first thing that you figure out. And I will say, for those of you that are on here that are looking for a potentially easier way to address this within your practice or business, our software, it's almost like having TurboTax, but for compliance, right? It's a very simple, affordable way. It'll actually guide you through your risk analysis electronically. It even develops policies, provides you automatically with employee trainings. It's a very easy to use online portal. If you would like to check that out, I did send a link. You can click on that link in the chat. You can actually request information there, and somebody on my team will follow up with you to make sure that we can have a conversation and get you details concerning that, right? Only if you have a need. So without further ado, would love to have some Q&A time here. If you have a question that I did not address throughout the course of the webinar, go ahead and ask it now. I'll spend some time going through these questions that we got, right? Lots of questions about the slides and the recording. So yes, everybody, you will get a copy of the slides. You will get a copy of the recording. You will also get a certificate in your email when the webinar is over. It takes about 24 hours sometimes to process all of that. You will always, that is not a problem. We will make sure we get that out to you, okay? So a question came in, can we get a sample template for risk assessment or any standard that can be a reference document? Okay, so for those of you that are looking for like a government resource for risk assessment, I would go ahead and Google HHS risk assessment tool. The government does have through healthit.gov an actual risk assessment template that you could use to go through. It is not the most user-friendly of things, and it requires a good amount of manual documentation for gaps and remediation. So it's not going to be the easiest thing you've ever done, but that can be a good place to start if you've never done it before. Our platform is something that automates all of that for you if you need help with that. Let me see. So a question came through, why does OCR conduct HIPAA audits? What is the civil rights connection? I think that in general, in the event that there's an audit being conducted, it's because there is a perceived privacy or security violation of the patients, right? So as far as the direct connection, it's really Health and Human Services that implements the regulation. OCR is just the enforcement body, and they get involved when there is a perceived privacy or security violation of the population, in this case being healthcare. So we received a question, do you have examples of home care / home health / hospice agencies? So I'll say we work with, on our end, we work with, and I have personally worked with dozens of home health care and hospice agencies. Typically, home health care is uniquely challenging because the majority of your workforce is probably remote, right? Working out in the field, which makes accountability for some of these things very difficult. Usually it's recommended that you have some sort of a means of electronically distributing policies and trainings to those folks, as well as having things like work from home policies, telecommuting policies, if people could be working from their own homes or out in the field, super important. So I'm a solo practitioner. Would this still be a benefit for me in my practice? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're referring to our service, we are the endorsed solution of the American Psychological Association, as well as many other small practice groups. So if you are a solo practice and you need an easy way of getting this done, we can absolutely help you. We work with very large organizations, and we have a tailored program for our solo providers. I'm just looking, I apologize, folks. I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but we'll go through a couple more. So what types of additional policies should a medical practice have in place aside from the policies that are already in a standard HIPAA manual? Something that we find is often missing is actually work from home policies. Okay, if you have staff that commonly could be working from home or accessing patient information on a device from home, whether that's their own device or a practice provided device, you should have a work from home policy or a telecommuting policy, as well as something called a bring your own device policy, so that employees are making sure that they're following a clear set of standards if they decide to use their own device. Because then even if an employee makes a mistake, as long as you can prove that you had the policy in place and that they signed off on it, that gives you the evidence that you would need to show to the OCR in the event of an investigation like this. Another one that's commonly missing is social media policies. We live in a very heavily digital age. If there is potential for your employees to be engaging with patients in social media formats, you absolutely should implement a social media policy within the practice. Again, that's something that we have that built into our program for every single client that goes through our process. We give you a full set of templates for those. Security and privacy policies, do they need to be separate or can they be combined? So you can combine them into one manual, but they should be clearly delineated what is a security policy and what is a privacy policy, because they're going to fall under HIPAA rules. So that's something that's worth checking in on. So really good question. Are business associates required to maintain privacy policies and procedures, given that the privacy rule prescribes requirements for covered entities? So a business associate, if that's the category that you fall into, usually needs very, very few privacy policies as compared to a covered entity. Like you mentioned, the privacy rule requirements are going to be primarily dealing with the way that a provider interacts with their patients and use and disclosures in that context. Much of it is not going to apply to you if you are a business associate, so you would want to focus on the security policies and maybe the few privacy policies that might apply to you. Apologies, folks, just give me 1 second. So other than risk assessments, what is another common gap you see in privacy programs? Probably the most common gap is missing policy attestations. Okay, a lot of organizations implement policies and an employee might sign off on them when initially onboarding. It is commonly missed that they are then making those policies a part of their annual retraining of the staff. That is a big deal, because if you have employees that have been with you for a couple of years, your policies have hopefully been updated in the last couple of years. If you don't have proof that they've reviewed your policies and that employee does something that they shouldn't, it could get you into trouble. So we do have templates again for all of the policies. I just got a question on if we have templates for all of the different policies we've been discussing. Yes, those are built right into our program. So if you'd like to learn more about the platform, you can request information when you get off, or you can click that link I sent in the chat. Those are all incorporated into the program. So another business associate question. And I have time for two more questions, so I'll be able to answer this one, and then we'll do one more. If you didn't get your question answered, I apologize sincerely. We will make sure that somebody on our team follows up with you. But another business associate question, and I'm going to answer this one because I know that a lot of this content is geared towards covered entities, was as a BA, once breach notification and full investigation has been completed and provided to the provider, do I, as the BA, have to file an annual report with the OCR, or does it fall on the provider? So if the breach happened on your end, you would be responsible for filing that breach notification with the OCR. It's only if the breach occurred at the practice directly, like the practice themselves was the one that had a breach and it had nothing to do with you, you of course would not have to worry about it. But if you were the one who had the breach, you are responsible for all of those notifications and would want to make sure that you're maintaining that documentation. Absolutely. So another good question. So if use of social media, HIPAA compliance, etc., are in the office manual, do the staff have to sign off on each individual policy, or can they sign the office manual? So yeah, they could sign off on the manual as a whole. I would say that you would probably want to keep certain things separated from your, let's say, general HR employee handbook, right? Because in the event that an audit occurs, you want to be able to show that your employees were attesting specifically to HIPAA policies, what that table of contents was and what was in those policies. And if there's a bunch of general HR stuff, employee onboarding, whatever's mixed in there, that's not HIPAA specific, it can kind of muddy the waters a little bit during the process of an investigation. So having some of it separated, but it's not too much of a concern beyond that. All right. So folks, thank you for all the questions. I apologize, I was not able to get to everybody. Again, if you have a question that was not answered, you could please reach out to us. Thank you again for attending. I know that a 45-minute webinar about HIPAA compliance is probably not the bright shining star at the top of your day, but hopefully this was helpful and gave you some good information. We love to receive feedback. So when you close out the webinar today, there's going to be a brief questionnaire. It's legitimately 3 or 4 questions. If you could please just take a second and fill that out. It just lets us know if you'd like more information that we could send to you, but also if you have feedback on the content of the webinar today, we love to hear that as well. We are proactively trying to make these better and more relevant to our audiences. Also, if you have anything good to say, if you liked the presentation and you were happy with it, please let us know as well. It's always great to hear. So I appreciate all of your time today. Thank you again. If you'd like more information, please feel free to reach out. My email and my direct line is here, so you can reach out to me directly if you need to. Thank you all so much. We hope you have a great evening.